Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the second chapter in the book of Lamentations. We made it all the way up until the 11th verse. It's a chapter of 22 verses, as is every chapter in the book of Lamentations, or some multiplication thereof. And the reason that it is because each of them, with the exception of the fifth, is arranged in a Hebrew poetic technique, which is known as an acrostic. That means that each verse begins with a word which begins with a letter in the alphabetical order in which they appear, from Aleph to Tau. These are the A's and Z's of the Hebrew language, and there are no vowels in them. That's why there's number 22. So the number 22 does appear frequently. And other examples of acrostics are the 119th Psalm, the single longest chapter in the entire range of Scripture. An interesting fact, it's the midpoint of the Bible between Old and New Testament, lays somewhere in there, and it consists of 176 verses, which is 22 sets of 8. Each of the 8 words described begin with the same letter in the Hebrew language. And also Psalm 145, where 13b, it's a 21 verse psalm, but 13b marks the 14th letter in that. And these are not best read as prophecy, even though they are customarily classified as prophecy in the English arrangement of the Bible. In the Hebrew original, it was arranged in the writings. So what we call the Old Testament, the ancient Jews called the law, the writings, and the prophecies, and their arrangement and orderment is slightly different than the one we know. So it was the same. It's placed next to Abraham because Jeremiah, because he's the one who wrote it, but it's still not prophecy. These are writings, poetic, profound, just gripping imagery and emotion start to finish, but there's not a whole lot of prophecy. What it is the witnessing of the fulfillment of negative prophecy, the sense of being abandoned and being alone and being forsaken, and to be at the mercy of the enemy. And in the second chapter, we read of the righteous fury, the righteous wrath of Yahweh, and everything he does is righteous. Hence, he is righteous to inflict his wrath even on his own chosen people, and make even the righteous remnant, such as Jeremiah and children, suffer for the sins of the collective covenant nation, which by this point had exhausted their hour of grace. So Jeremiah is likened to the weeping prophet, with good reason. His 40-year prophetic ministry witnessed the decline and then the demise and the deluge of his beloved Judah and Jerusalem. He warned to repent because the judgment was imminent for 40 years, and then it came true. And this is him in the post-conquest, when Jerusalem is a shadow of her former self, reduced to a laughingstock, a byword, a proverb, a ghost town, and just a place of death, disease, and cannibalism. So the chapter which leads up to it, he writes, "He burns against Israel like a flaming fire, consuming all around." So it's nothing personal against Israel. That's Jacob. That's what it means. He's just consuming everyone in its midst and its past. Jeremiah is still living in this ghost town. He slays all who delighted the eye. He has poured out his wrath like fire. So his wrath has been poured out like fire. He has expressed the full fury and just magnitude of his wrath. And then he increases mourning and lamentation. This is the response of Jeremiah, and the ordinary, normal response of a citizen left over to sort of dwell in this shadow of its former self-time. Her gates have sunk unto the ground, verse 9. He has destroyed and broken her bars. Her kings and our rulers are among the Gentiles. The law is no more, and the prophets have found no vision from Yahweh. Now, Jeremiah himself was a prophet, and he had the vision of what would come to pass, and here it was. But the prophet, the law, the king, all the items of pride which were emblematic of of everything Judah had to be proud of as a nation state had been violently removed. There's no gate that wouldn't go up until Nehemiah returned in the year 445 BM before Messiah. But the prophet Jeremiah is writing these lamentations, which are expressions of sincere sorrow and grief, sometime between the years 586 and 581. In that year, he was exiled in Egypt, where he ended up dying. So the 12th verse reads, they say to their mothers, where is grain and wine? And they languish like the wounded in the streets of the city. So this connects to the daughter of my people, of which we read of in the 11th verse. So what's painful about the suffering here is that the children, who through no fault of their own, they were innocent of the sins of their fathers and their forefathers, but it had piled up so much that the retribution had to fall squarely on their laps where they were when they lived, through no fault of their own. And they're asking, where is the food, where is the wine? And they're languishing like the wounded in the street of the city. So this is a sight all around him. Jeremiah is sitting on the street corner, beholding and observing everything that he's recording in this book. And that is not a pleasant sight. And, their life is poured over in their mother's bosom. The one who gave them life has to bury the ones that they gave life to. How shall I admonish you? To what shall I compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? To what shall I liken you to comfort you, O maiden daughter of Zion? For your breach is great as the sea. Who shall heal you? Now, the word comfort appears earlier in this book, and it's always the absence of a comforter. Jeremiah feels bereft of a comforter. He feels completely abandoned and forsaken at this moment in time because he is living as a vagabond in rags in a ghost town, having preached the word of Yahweh for 40 years, and everything he said come to pass, and now he's living in it, and Yahweh has sort of left him in what he paid the price of the prophet, which was to live in his own negative prediction. And there's the wound is unhealable, he says. They have a wound, a sickness that there's no immediate cure for except for captivity. Time does heal all wounds, so the 70 years away is going to make them return with a greater appreciation for the covenant, which washed them away for 70 years. Your prophets have seen falsehood and folly for you, and have not shown you your wickedness to turn back your captivity, but their visions for you are false and misleading messages. Jeremiah had no shortage of contention against the false prophets. These were the people he issues his indictment of. I did one recently on chapter 23, beginning in verse 9. But these false prophets, they claim their own authority, and truth goes a-begging, but lies are a more lucrative commodity. These people were adept at telling people what they wanted to hear, whereas the real, authentic prophet with integrity, Jeremiah, was busy telling people what they needed to know, that judgment is right around the corner. These false prophets were crying peace when there was no peace to be had. There was death and destruction literally at their door, and because the people believed in the falsehood, they thought that nothing this awful could come to them. They could not be visited by the full covenantal curses. They listened to the lies rather than the proof. And that is why their false and misleading message, there is no greater indictment or evidence against that than their current situation, because they are not in peace. They are not well. They are not whole. They are not a fully functioning. They are not a healthy city or people. They have recently been ravaged and conquered and displaced. So the false prophets, the ones they had listened to, they were paying the price of listening to them now, but they had Jeremiah the whole time telling them what they needed to know, but he ended up in a dungeon for his message. All who pass by have clapped their hands at you. They have whistled, and they shake their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this city that is called the perfection of loveliness? the joy of all the earth. So the perfection of loveliness is Psalm 50, verse 2. The perfection of loveliness is Psalm 48, 2. The Judeans clearly had an exalted vision of the beauty and the meaning and the significance and the sacrosanctity of their city of Jerusalem, which was, among other things, the site of the temple, which was the most treasured possession in all Jerusalem that they had. And now these foreigners are walking by, pointing and laughing and whispering and sneering at this ghost town, this shadow of its former self, of this great city that once was great, but has since been reduced to rubble. And that is, it's not the perfection of loveliness. It is not the joy of all the earth for anyone at this present moment in time. All they have is the memory of it. All your enemies have opened their mouth against you, and they have whistled as they gnash their teeth. They say, "We have swallowed her up. This is certainly the day we waited for. We have found it, and we have seen it." So they were motivated by a plan to conquer and pillage and ravage this plan, and they were witnessing and boasting in the fulfillment of their plan. Their military strategy have worked. They could talk trash in their town against them and they can gnash their teeth and say all sorts of nasty things in mean-spirited ways because they had come and overtaken and overrun and conquered and left the city a desolate ruin. So they were able to say all these things because they were living in the fulfillment of what Jeremiah had predicted. Yahweh has done what he planned. He has filled his word, which he commanded in days of old. He has torn down without mercy, and he has let your enemy rejoice over you. He has exalted the horns of your adversary. So Jeremiah in verse 17 has an unshakable faith in the sovereign righteousness of Elohim's plan. Now, everything that Judah was currently experiencing, those left in Jerusalem were a ghost town. The lucky ones were the ones who were traveling across the desert, some 500 to 1,000 miles to the east, to the city of Babylon, to be controlled in a population. Really only the poor were left behind, and Jeremiah was one of them because he preached a message. He didn't attract an audience or an income. He attracted approach and imprisonment, and this was the price that he paid for the prophecy. But he knew that what he had preached, he told them that this would happen, and here it had happened, and the enemy is rejoicing, and Yahweh did not have mercy on those who did not take their covenant responsibility seriously, and he has exalted the horns of your adversary, and rightly so, because he had not failed them, they had failed him. Their heart cried out to Yahweh, O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears run down like the river are day and night. Give yourself no respite, let your eyes have no rest. So he's telling him to keep your eyes awake, stay awake and alert, and don't fall asleep, because what is around you is a sight and spectacle to not miss. The city that you love and treasure, and the wall are being torn down. That means an enemy conqueror is coming over, pressing through the walls. They would remain in ruin and rubble at least till 4:45 p.m. when Nehemiah came through and kind of cleaned it all up and restored the walls of Zion and Jerusalem. But he's telling them to spend every day of every hour crying. That's what he's doing. He's the weeping prophet, and he's giving himself no rest. So he's asking the nation to join in him in his mourning for the collective fate of their beloved people and land. Arise, cries out in the night, in the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the face of Yahweh. Lift your hands towards him. For the life of your young children who languish from hunger at the head of every street. So this is a beautiful way of a man who has a clear, intimate relationship and communicative connection with Yahweh. The language he uses, pour out your heart like water. before the face of Yahweh. Only someone who has seen and beheld the face of Yahweh would be able to say something like that, and to just have that intimate connection reflected in that language is a reminder that we are not dealing with an ordinary author, but an inspired one. And again, once more, his concern, Yahweh's concern for the children, the unprotected, and the vulnerable, the innocent who suffer, who languish from hunger and through your own irresponsibility. Children are a treasure in the eyes of Yahweh, and they're to be protected and provided for. Yet the sins of the father were inflicting themselves on these innocent infants who had no chance and no opportunity to even abuse the agency they had been given. They may have handled the covenant differently than their ancestors, but because their ancestors had repeatedly violated it, this was visited upon them through no fault of their own, and that was a sight for weeping eyes that Jeremiah had to tend to. See, O Yahweh, and look attentively, to whom you have thus done thus. Should the woman eat their offspring, infants of a Topha? Should the priest and prophet be slain in the temple of Yahweh? So he's looking around him, he's looking at his conditions and his circumstances. He's seeing cannibalism in the street where the mothers are eating and roasting their children, and there's no prophet. They're being killed in the temple, which has itself been destroyed, and he's asking him to look attentively to remind himself that you have done this to your beloved and chosen people, and this is a lot to grasp and wrestle with by faith, that it is the righteous wrath of Yahweh. His wrath is never pleasant, especially those who are affected by it, even through no fault of their own, but it is always and only righteous and just. The Jews had merited this wrathful retribution, and even though Jeremiah was faithful to the message and he paid the price of the prophet all the way, the price, his life would be miserable because of the calling that he was embraced to have. Young and old lie on the ground in the streets. My maidens and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your displeasure. You have slaughtered without mercy. So indifferent and impartial to the young and the old, no matter what age they are slain in the street by an enemy, bloodthirsty conqueror, and the servants and young men, they have been fallen victim of the sword. And this is the day of your displeasure, the day of your wrath. Not quite the same thing as the day of Yahweh, but certainly significant day of judgment when his final covenant nation left, that of Judah, met the same fate that met Assyria over 100 years ago. And he has slaughtered them without mercy. Now, he will have mercy on who he will have mercy, so him not having mercy, even if it's a technically correct statement, does not compromise or diminish his completely righteous nature. 22nd and final verse. Would you proclaim, as in a day of appointed times, the fears that surround me, and no one escaped or survived, in the day of the displeasure of Yahweh, those whom I have nursed and brought up, my enemy has destroyed. So he's asking him a question that if that is he aware of the fears which surround him? He is surrounded by things that one naturally has fear to be. There's no walls in his city. There's no protection from animals or humans. There are marauding bandits just coming to and fro, looting and plundering, and no one has escaped or survived. They're all being carted off, or they're all either dead, and this is the day of your displeasure and death. And those who I have nursed and brought up, that means children. So he's inflicting his wrath mostly on the vulnerable and the innocent. They are the ones who feel it and experience most. And the tragedy of it all is that it is through no fault of their own. But that is the price we pay when we are derelict in our generational duty to provide for our children a safe future where good may flourish and evil not prevail. So the covenantal consequences were completely and totally merited, and the enemy had not been destroyed yet, but they would be eventually. There is always a future. So even though Judah doesn't have really a song in the night at this moment in time, these are honest expressions. And even though a lot of these statements can be interpreted as doubtful, when we really understand and empathize with Jeremiah's present predicament and situation and circumstance, these statements become more understandable, and even in any case, they are beautiful and poignant. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye bye.